Welcome. I'm Geoffrey G. O'Brien, professor of English at UC Berkeley and a former colleague of Robert Haas, from whom we'll hear today. I have the pleasure of not only being a former colleague, but a former graduate student of Bob's, from whom in the early 90s I inherited a pedagogical model and a disposition in the classroom. I remember that Bob could really meet any kind of aesthetic, any kind of student where they were, and focused mostly on suggesting, quite tactfully, poetic examples from the literary record that would rhyme with whatever the student was trying to do. You could just instantly feel Bob's brilliant access to the poems and his erudition lightly worn. But it was really combined with a patience about student development. It was quite clear that he didn't feel that it all had to happen at once. It just had to start happening or be happening. And I've taken that with me into classroom after classroom ever since. It was also such a pleasure to ever hear him speak in department meetings, promotion meetings. The whole literary record comes in, so many intuitions and correspondences. He was really a pleasure to listen to for the better part of 2 decades for me and longer for other colleagues. I'm going to start with a little biographical information. It would be quicker to list the awards and accomplishments that Bob doesn't have, but here is some information about an incredible life in letters. Robert Haas was born in San Francisco, grew up in Marin County, and attended St. Mary's College and Stanford University. He's the author of 7 books of poetry, the co-translator with Czesław Miłosz of 10 volumes of the Polish poet's work, as well as a volume of translations of Japanese haiku and 4 book essays. Another volume of Czesław Miłosz's poems in translation is forthcoming, as well as another book of poems and of essays. His first book of poems, Field Guide, received the Yale Younger Poets Prize. His second book, Praise, the William Carlos Williams Prize from the Academy of American Poets. His fourth book, Human Wishes, won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry. His fifth book, Time and Materials, received both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. And his first book of essays received the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. And the later volume, What Light Can Do, received Penn's Diamonstein Spielvogel Award in 2012 for special excellence in the art of the essay. He has received a Penn Award and an award from the Association of Scholars in Slavic Languages for his collaborative translations. And volumes of his poems in translation have appeared in a dozen languages, including Spanish, German, Swedish, Norwegian, Polish, Hebrew, and Mandarin. Robert Haas began his teaching career at the State University of New York at Buffalo. He was there from 1967 to 71. He returned to the Bay Area and taught at his alma mater, St. Mary's, from 1971 to 1989, and then landed here at UC Berkeley from 1989 all the way to 2019. Like any 30-year stretch, it was an eventful stretch, and we'll be hearing about that. He also served as a visiting lecturer at the University of Virginia, Columbia University, and the University of Iowa, and was the Samuel Fisher Professor of Comparative Literature at the Free University in Berlin for a semester. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a MacArthur Fellow, a Fellow of the Bicentennial Exchange between Great Britain and the United States in 1976-77, and served as Poet Laureate of the United States from 1995 to 1997. During his time as Poet Laureate, he organized Watershed, a national conference at the Library of Congress on environmental literature, and from 1996 to 2001, wrote a weekly column about poetry and poets for the Washington Post. In 2014, he received the Wallace Stevens Prize from the Academy of American Poets for, quote, proven mastery in the art of poetry, and proven it has been. Welcome, Bob. I thought that we would start by thinking about what the Bay Area has meant to you and how Berkeley loomed or shone for you long before you actually started working here, given that you grew up, a stone's throw from the university.
Yes, I was saying to you earlier, Geoffrey, that when I don't know if it was in grammar school or early in high school, but my father took us to Cal football games on some occasions. And I remember one, I think I might have been in high school, and crowded, very excited. My brother and I, of course, had drawn pictures from, in those days, there were still cartoonists for the sports pages of the newspapers. So we had all assiduously done pencil imitations of the heroic drawings of the Cal quarterback. Anyway, we got there and we stopped for lunch, and I noticed all these gorgeous looking people sitting around reading books on subjects like nuclear physics, and books in kinds of typography. It was probably Russian that I didn't recognize. And I thought, wow, this is an amazing place. And so Berkeley always was a magical place to me. And then, of course, in my St. Mary's is just over the hill from Berkeley. And I lived in Berkeley for part of the time when I was a student at St. Mary's. So then, having gone to Stanford to graduate school and then to Buffalo, New York to teach, getting back to Berkeley, which I did in 1971, was getting home.
I want to forgive you for going to Stanford and concentrate on that for a little bit. One of the things that's interesting to me about it is just that you did it at all at that particular time, by which I simply mean that the vocation of poetry wasn't as decisively tied to the profession of literature compared to now, or even the last 20, 30 years. So I'm wondering what made you think about becoming a professor of English alongside your unstoppable.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, I thought, to me at the time, there was no connection really, or it didn't occur to me that there was one. I think there were two graduate programs in creative writing in 1963 when I was graduating from college. The one in Iowa and maybe at Stanford. I was unaware of either one. I knew I vaguely wanted to be a writer of some kind. And I was partly drawn to Stanford because I'd heard that there were writers there. The Irish short story writer Frank O'Connor was there. In college, I had started to read a book called Politics in the Novel by a critic named Irving Howe, and I knew he was at Stanford. So there was also famously conservative poet Ivor Winters that I was unaware of until I got there. And when I got there to Stanford, in fact, Frank O'Connor and Irving Howe had left. So I thought in college that first I admired my professors, and they got to read books for a living. And so it seemed like, and it was, I don't know, a senior in college have any models for how you would go about being a writer just then. So I had to do something. So I applied to graduate school. And in fact, though I started writing poetry intensely and seriously at Stanford, and it was partly under the influence of the people who were there, I thought that writing poetry was my own private business and had almost nothing to do with my trying to get a degree, and so I could be a professor and get to read books for a living. And in fact, when I interviewed for a job, my first job at Buffalo, I didn't even mention that I wrote poetry. I was doing a dissertation in the history of the novel at the time. So yeah, it was interesting. By the time, Geoffrey, what year did you start at Berkeley?
92. Oh, you mean as a grad student or as a professor?
As a graduate student.
Yeah, 92.
So 62. So there were really 30 years difference in our experience coming in. And over those 30 years, it was most of the poets in America at that point were teaching creative writing in universities and colleges. It's interesting, huge difference.
Yeah, sea change, mostly economically driven. It's the only patron left.
Am I right in remembering my recollection of you as a graduate student, besides just I thought your writing was brilliant, was that I told you to go away.
You did, and I heeded it. I came back.
It wasn't that I didn't like Berkeley or love Berkeley or the profession, but I thought, oh, this guy should not be writing papers read by one person for the next 4 years. He should go someplace where he can write his poems.
Here is Bob's generosity already reversing the charges of the interview. Back on you. Before we leave Stanford, though, for the sake of literary history, um, tell me what it was like being around Ivor Winters under his tutelage to whatever extent you were.
I wasn't under his tutelage for sure, but my first it was the quarter system at Stanford, and my first class uh, was history of English poetry taught by Ivor Winters. Winters was a bulky, medium-sized guy. Uh, People said he'd been a boxer in college. He wore baggy, dusty old suits. Had a complexion of someone who loved wine. He must have been 60, but he seemed ancient to me. And he came into the classroom and started speaking. And I don't think I'd ever heard anybody speak so passionately about anything. It was completely riveting. And in fact, he began by saying, I know why you come in here. You've heard that I'm the eccentric old man who thinks that Yeats shouldn't have written fascist poems, that Hart Crane got sold the Brooklyn Bridge by Emerson, that Keats's sonnets are blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so let me tell you something. How did he say it? He said, let me tell you something. Here's a definition of poetry. It's a statement in words about a human experience in which the rhythm exactly conveys the feeling and the thought. Something like that, he said. Most of you can't even hear the rhythm of poetry. And then he recited a poem to demonstrate to us that none of us would understand the rhythm of poetry. And then he said, my friend Hart Crane committed suicide. My friend Ezra Pound was committed to an insane asylum. The history of poetry since the Romance is full of the wreckage of poets who waded into their feelings. You're not going to do it. You're going to be sentimental old college professors dabbling your toes in the destruction of your betters. And he said, that's all I have to say for today. And he walked out of the classroom. He was wearing an armband, black armband, in mourning for the 3 Mississippi African-American girls who were killed in a church bombing that summer. He walked across the campus to teach his Melville course carrying a very heavy iron harpoon. Anyway, he was a riveting figure, and he certainly got me reading poetry with great intensity. I disagreed with almost every word he said. There were lots of people who went on to really interesting poetry there at the time. Robert Pinsky and John Matthias and Jim McMichael among them. Scott Momaday had been there before. Tom Gunn had been there before. Phil Levine had been there. There are a lot of poets around Winters. And I didn't, he was, wasn't that he was poisonous to me. But in fact, at a certain point, he wrote a book called In Defense of Reason. And that was part of what made him notorious as a critic and a poet at the time, that he thought that the formlessness of romantic poetry, the exploration of not knowing what you were going to explore, the sublime, the infinite, scary stuff should only be approached with a rational discursive formality. Otherwise, you got into real trouble. That was his sort of basic thing. And that the great poets, Shakespeare, Donne, so on, had these structures that got lost somehow. And so that was the line that he took. And I didn't like it at the time. I thought, of course, I was interested in the way the imagination does get lost and finds itself. That seemed to me the great thing in poetry. But and I went up to him one day after class, just gathered my forces. It was that fall that John Kennedy was assassinated. The world was raw with the sudden violence that was going to be continued in the assassination of his brother and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. It was 1963 was a very raw time in American culture. And so I imagined confronting Winters. So I went up to him and after class one day and said, how can you call a book in defense of reason and then just bully students every day? And I was almost trembling for saying it. And he looked as if I'd kicked him in the gut. He looked completely hurt and said, oh, I'm so sorry you have that impression, and kept on walking. And I felt terrible. Suddenly he became a human being. Anyway, so that was about the story of my relation to Winters.
Glad I asked. So you go from that possibly conservative, oracular culture around poetry to the hotbed of Buffalo in the late 60s. What was that transition like, and moving into becoming a professor in your own right?
I was writing poetry, had met a group of people to share poems with at Stanford, supposedly writing a dissertation about the English novel or the European novel. And in those days, even though I had been told by the chairman of the English department that he personally was going to tell people not to touch me with a 10-foot pole because I have such a rabble rouser, that I had, and it was nothing special about me, I had 11 job offers at the end of 4 years of graduate school before I had finished a dissertation. And that was, I think, quite common at that point. It was 63 must have been the turning point to the moment when suddenly tons of people were going to graduate school, and history of the GI Bill, many more people going to undergraduate school. And there was a national effort to get college teachers to teach all these people. So, and the job I accepted was the one at Buffalo because it had the reputation of being the most exciting place in the country for poetry, and for not just poetry. Novelist John Barth was there, Leslie Fiedler, novelist and critic. It seemed like a very lively place. So I was very, very happy to get an offer from them and to get in a car and drive across the country to Buffalo.
Were you teaching?
Which was that lively. Almost everyone was. The day of driving into town, I recognized the poet John Logan, whom I'd met on the West Coast, and I stopped to introduce myself, and he introduced me to the guy he was walking with, a man named Saltauster, who was the attorney to the president of the university and who had just published a book of poems and was on a way to the bookstore to give a reading from his new book of poems. And at that reading, I met dozens of the young poets of the Buffalo scene, and they invited me that weekend to a big poetry festival in a park, which included the Irish poet Austin Clarke and Bob Creeley and John Wiener. Anyway, many of the poets of what had been the San Francisco beat scene and its overlap with the Black Mountain scene. I don't know if these terms are going to mean anything to anybody in the future, Geoffrey. And suddenly I was in the midst of this very exciting literary scene in Buffalo. It was really fun.
I realize I don't know exactly what you were hired to do, though.
To teach the history of the novel.
Okay. So
I did a
you apply over
seminar.
time into
I did a
poetry?
seminar. Buffalo was an amazing place at that time because the state of New York was suddenly pouring money into its public education system. And a man named Albert Cook, poet and scholar who taught at Berkeley, was turned away from tenure at Berkeley. Went to Buffalo and hired every loose pistol in the country. So it was just a very exciting place and a lot going on. So the older faculty there were determined that it was going to be a better place for young faculty than their experience had been. I remember one critic, Irving Massey, saying about his graduate time at Cornell that the only thing Homeric about Cornell, about Ithaca, was the Olympian contempt of the senior faculty for the junior faculty. And so the senior faculty at Buffalo were determined that it was going to be different from their experience of that old starchy formality of the university English department in the 1940s and 50s. I say that old starchy formality as if I knew that was so. Of course, I don't know anything about it, but that was the take. So it was a very lucky time. I think I taught a seminar called Adultery and Revolution about sex and politics in the novel to graduate students. Most of them were older than I was at that point. I'd just been in 4 years of graduate school, so I was like 22 or 23 years old and teaching a graduate course. It's ridiculous.
So when did your professional training and your private life as a poet start to converge institutionally? When did you first teach poetry?
I don't remember which year. I taught introductory literature courses, but in a short time, Robert Creeley was going on leave, and I was going to take over his class, and though I was supposed to be working on this dissertation, I was just reading poetry, and there was so much of it then. Hit that generation of poets born in the 20s, starting to publish in the 50s, where the variety of experience that they were getting at made me think, compared to the novels I was reading, compared to Updike, Malamud, Roth, Cheever, it felt like what was happening in American poetry was incredibly exciting to me. So I said to Bob Creeley, why don't I teach a course in contemporary poetry and invite the poets I teach to come and teach on alternate weeks? So we went to the chair and said, can we take Bob Creeley's salary and hire poets to teach every other week? That is, and they would come Tuesday, give a lecture, give a reading on Wednesday night, teach on Thursday. And they said, fine. So the first person I asked was Allen Ginsberg to come and teach. He said, I will only do it if you invite Gregory Corso. to come. So I invited Gregory Corso, and then because I was enthralled at that point with Denise Levertov and everyone, and she was writing her poems of the Vietnam War period, I invited Denise and Robert Bly, and so on. Anyway, so that was my first experience of teaching a poetry class, was teaching this class that was like a festival. The auditorium was jammed with people, and Gregory Corso would come in and came in and gave a talk about the Lascaux cave paintings, making the argument that they had found morning glory seeds in the cave, which and the remains of fires, which meant that everybody was getting stoned on morning glory seeds, and the Lascaux caves were basically the first Fillmore Auditorium light show, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, Allen Ginsberg, on the other hand, wrote down on the board from memory the opening stanza of Shelley's Ode to a Skylark on one side and the Diamond Sutra on the other, and demonstrated that they had the same vowel pattern as a way of doing meditative breathing to achieve ecstasy through poetry. Anyway, it was fun. Those days were fun.
Perfect metonyms of that moment and those poets.
Yeah.
We should reprise that at Berkeley. I just don't know how we'll get the money. So why did you leave in 71 and go back to your alma mater for the better part of 2 decades?
I just wanted, I had some feeling, well, there are several reasons. The first reason was I had promised my wife we would stay no more than 4 years in Buffalo. And the second reason was I had a feeling that whatever I was going to do as a writer, I would do better if I lived in the place where I grew up, if I knew what happened to the people I went to school with and what happened. And then I just loved that culture and the physical beauty of the place. So it was it was enormously exciting in Buffalo, and there are quite amazing things about it at that point. In the Merce Cunningham and John Cage were visitors in the English department at that time. Michel Foucault was a visitor in the French department at that time. There were Archie Shepp, the jazz musician, was teaching these music courses. It was, anyway, but it was time for me to go home. So, and the lesson of the writers in the place was that they didn't, that they had begun they hadn't begun in the most prestigious schools. Bob Creeley started it at University of New Mexico. Leslie Fiedler was teaching at the University of Montana. John Barth at Pennsylvania State University. They had gone to quiet places and done their work. So what was great about Buffalo was the lesson of being there was to leave.
So you go back to a very different culture. Were you teaching great books courses?
Yeah, St. Mary's, I have a major as an undergraduate. St. Mary's had a 4-year great book program where you did Greek literature, philosophy, and mathematics and science in the freshman year, and Roman medieval. In the sophomore year, you did Ptolemy's Almagest as your math course, etc. And so it was the St. John's of Annapolis curriculum. Completely useless. I learned calculus and Leibniz's notation. Hard to think of a less useful thing. Anyway, so yes, I went back and I taught mostly world literature seminars, and I didn't teach creative writing there. But by the time I was under no pressure to there. My second year at St. Mary's, I'd had a book of poems published, and there was a little article in the Chronicle, but back in the day when you would still do that, saying that, I won the Yale Younger Poets Prize. And as coming on campus that morning, I met the Christian brother, the monk who was the chair of the history department, and he looked at me and said, "Calling attention to oneself, I see." It was very much the opposite of publisher parish at St. Mary's. It was teach these lively students, and so I did. Though I remember my first day in my first seminar, we had been reading reading Plato's Apology, story of Socrates in prison, and I had learned at Buffalo to teach lecture courses, or I didn't learn, but I went about it. And so when I got to St. Mary's and I was in this room with 15 kids and said, "Well, so what did you think of Socrates?" And one young woman said, "I think he must have been very old." I thought, yeah, okay, he's ready to die because he's so, and I didn't know what the follow-up question was. I had to teach myself to teach people to have a conversation about a book. It was fun.
So are you saying you never taught a grad or undergrad workshop until you came to Berkeley?
No, well, no. Then actually, I got invited after I'd published a book of poems. I got invited at San Jose State University to teach a night school open admissions creative writing class. $100 a week. That's a lot of tennis shoes. I had 3 children at that point. And so I would get on the Nimitz and drive down there on Mondays and teach from 6 to 9. And it was my first experience of teaching creative writing, which was really just of looking at poems people brought in and sharing them. And the open night school meant a dentist from Fremont who wanted to write Oscar Hammerstein song lyrics, and a white witch from the Santa Cruz Mountain who wanted to write spells, and gifted high school dropout. One of the gifted high school dropouts was Lorna Cervantes, who went on to be one of the originary writers of recent Latinx poetry. Anyway, it was that was my introduction to when did you first teach a creative writing class? But did you have creative writing class as an undergraduate?
I did. I took classes with Seamus Heaney and Lucy Brock-Broido. And at Iowa, 92 to 94, I taught undergraduate workshops there.
Yeah, I had I don't think it occurred to anybody to teach creative writing class at St. Mary's in the time I was there.
And if they did, it would have been almost exclusively not the poetry of the students in the room, probably. And so you're there through 1988 at St. Mary's. And what made you make the jump to public, to larger, to Berkeley?
Well, I was offered the job. So I came back from Buffalo to teach at St. Mary's, and we lived in Berkeley from 1971 for the 18 years I taught at St. Mary's. Though I was away part of the time. It was at least 1 year in England and a couple of years in which I wasn't teaching. But I first taught at Berkeley as a Holloway. As you know, the university received from a graduate, Roberta Holloway, professor of English at San Jose State, an endowment of a fund to bring a poet. I think in those days they said a younger poet to Berkeley to teach for 1 semester. And as you know, we've had since, I guess, 1980, 88 or so, a visitor every year from the generosity of that endowment. Anyway, I was fairly early on. Don't think I remember what year, but around 1982 or 83, I had taught for a semester at Berkeley. And the poet Robert Pinsky was teaching then in the English department, and we were friends. And so and living in Berkeley, of course, it's a company town. You knew who I had friends who were in the English department. Anyway, when Robert Pinsky pulled up stakes and left to go to Boston, they hired another poet and they offered me the job. And I jumped to it.
So you
Still
come
being
in.
the little kid who had watched the guy reading a book on physics on the cafe on Telegraph Avenue and thinking, wow, this is a cool place.
So it's 1989. People are taking hammers to the wall in Berlin. New historicism is flourishing in the English department, or is about to. What was it like when you came into that department culturally, especially coming from a place like St. Mary's?
Well, I was saying to a young person the other day who's just starting in the English department that because St. Mary's is very small, about 1,500 students then, I think there are 2,500 now. I knew the names of the children of the person who ran this telephone switchboard. If there was a faculty meeting about a personnel issue, you showed up. If it was somebody in astronomy or classical Greek, there were people you knew. You had to go to the meetings. So it was a small, familial place. So Berkeley felt anonymous to me. I felt like the English department felt like a mailbox for individual entrepreneurs compared to the feeling of St. Mary's. I came to see that that was not the case. But my first experience was, oh, okay, they gave me an office, they gave me a mailbox, and I'm on my own. So they would say, what do you want to teach? And I would say, I'm used to being told what I'm supposed to do. It's your turn to take, this course and that turn. So, but they did ask me to teach American poetry, which, given my odd education between the great books in college and the great books at St. Mary's and the graduate work and the novel, I really didn't know the history of American poetry. So that's one of the main things that happened to me, was that I had to think about how to do that. And then walking into a classroom in Berkeley in 1989 and seeing, I think I wrote to a friend, my class looks like a UNESCO postcard. Berkeley was just becoming a kind of place where the European American students were going to be no more than half of a classroom. And it was before Ward Connerly had managed to stifle the efforts to increase the number of Black and Latino students through affirmative action admissions programs. So it was very exciting and vibrant to walk into a room. First of all, walk into a room where 120 people were very excited to take a course in poetry was really interesting. And then the question was, what is it exactly that I have to give to them, or that American poetry has to give to them? So the first 3 or 4 years of being there, I don't remember what else I taught, but I do remember teaching that course and the excitement and the challenge, first of all, of learning. Do you start with the Puritan poetry? How much Puritan poetry? When I was growing up in California and my high school textbook had all this New England writing, I thought, this doesn't have anything to do with me. I didn't connect to it. So I didn't know what these kids were going to connect to. So what did I want to give them? And anyway, so that was interesting. And Berkeley was a feast, and still is, of course. One of the things I was thinking about and I'm sure you did too, as you taught it, was how do it if you have 13 weeks to teach, to convey some experiences. You're putting experiences in people's heads by making assignments for them to read, and you're organizing maps. This was also the period in English departments when the canon was under revision, when the whole idea of the canon as an authority was suddenly treated with appropriate suspicion. And so thinking about, well, how do I teach African American poetry? Do I go back to the beginning and teach this Phyllis Wheatley, who was a slave girl, who was dead at 24, I think, who published one remarkable book of poems, very much in the style of a bright student in the 18th century? Do I begin there? Or should I just jump in at the Harlem Renaissance, and etc.? My students who come in would tell me what classes they were excited by. And one of the legendary classes at Berkeley in the early 90s, late 1880s, was a course by the composer Ollie Wilson in African and African American music. African music in the first semester and African American music in the second. And I would run from my class to his class to audit the class. And he had done a PhD in musicology in Ghana and had gone all over the country making recordings. So if you walk into class, he would talk about polyrhythms and the difference between rhythmic conceptions in African and European music, and then play the recordings of these tub bands that he'd recorded at weddings and other formal events in Ghana, and then play Smithsonian recordings of South Carolina or Tennessee bands, and they sound exactly alike. And he would talk about and it was magical watching that structure, and it began to give me a vocabulary for figuring out how to teach the poetry. So I audited a lot of classes during the first couple of years I was there, while I was figuring out how to teach a lecture class and how to.
I love thinking of that tableau of the Berkeley student population producing this good pressure on you to complicate the story of American poetry precisely at the moment when canonicity is under significant and long overdue review. For those of you who don't know this, which is just about everybody, Bob handed me the U.S. Poetry Survey when he retired, and the same questions are still being wrestled with. I start with Bradstreet and then Wheatley, and then end up going to Dunbar after time with Walt and Emily. But I'm thinking of increasing and specifying further and enriching the 19th century. For instance, Dave the Potter. I want to look at some of those pots with poems on them that he threw, things like that. Thank you for giving me that class. It's one of the joys for me.
Another observation about the early times, I was spending all our time there, but in my experience in Buffalo and my experience at the University of Virginia, where I did a semester visiting at St. Mary's, was that sometimes the students came to office hours. Mostly in the afternoons, they wanted to be involved in intramural sports. So often I would sit in my office and read, somebody come by, be happy to talk to them. at St. Mary's, it was so informal that if I were late or something, the students would be sitting in my office chatting with each other. But mostly, they didn't show up for my office hours very much. And in Berkeley, as soon as I mentioned a book in class, by the way, if you're interested in this, you might want to read. The diligent students would show up at my door within the week to discuss the book that they had read. And in Wheeler Hall, there's no place for students to sit while they're waiting for a professor to see them in that corridor up on the fourth floor. And I found that when I would get to my office for my office hours, a dozen students would be sitting on the floor like boat people, patiently waiting for the 5 minutes in which I'd count the number of them and say, well, I have so many hours. In my third year there, I doubled my office hours, thinking maybe that would solve the problem. And it didn't. It just meant more people came when they came. And I thought, oh, they're all type A greyhounds that I'm teaching here. You can't just casually mention that they should read some book because they will feel under obligation to read it. You have to parcel this stuff out. So it was the intensity and often brilliance of the Berkeley students was a huge gift, but it was also something that needed to be managed. It seemed to me that my colleagues moved through Wheeler Hall as if they didn't want to be stationary targets, that they'd rush to the mailbox and they're always in a hurry to get, as many of them were, because to be the kind of writer and scholar that Berkeley assumes, you almost have two full-time jobs, the job of being a teacher and the job of being a writer or a scholar. And so people are moving very fast and figuring out how to give appropriate attention to the students, especially if you're teaching large classes, was another thing to figure out.
You couldn't move that quickly past Bob's office because there was an obstacle course of student knapsacks and knees waiting outside. So I can attest to the truth of what Bob is saying. What about the poetry culture at the university when you arrived? Tom Gunn was still there. Josephine Miles was a lingering presence, but was no longer obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I had been living in Berkeley for 15 years by the time I was on the faculty. So I was aware of the town gown issues. And in the university culture itself, it was Joe Miles for many, many years. And then Tom Gunn was hired, but Tom functioned as a lecturer and came and did his job and very much went back to the Castro into his San Francisco world and was not, in my years there, very deeply involved in the local poetry culture. Peter Scott was on the faculty and teaching classes in epic poetry and writing the quite amazing poems that he was writing. But he, outside of the university, someone said to me, I said, I've been invited to give a reading at Berkeley, and they said, it's like beating an old rug. That the feeling of the towny poets was that Berkeley was staid and insular, and the students sat there making judgments on you when you read your poems. And so one of the things that I was interested in doing on that side of things was to try to invite more local poets to read their poems at the university. And the culture was changing, and Robert Pinsky had partly changed it, had also made efforts in that direction. And so the culture, on the one hand, was very rich. One of the results of my being there was developing a relationship with Czesław Miłosz. I mean, if you're going to say, what were the amazing things that happened in the humanities culture of Berkeley in the second half of the 20th century, probably you would say Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew scriptures and Czeslaw Milosz's poetry are the two that would come the top of my head as that. And then there Josephine Miles' work and Tom Gunn's work. When I was hired, Maxine Hong Kingston and Bharti Mukherjee were hired, and Ishmael Reed was already there. And though they were lecturers, so they weren't the people, as you know, the way it works, who sit on the committees, who decide who organize the readings and so on. They didn't do that. They didn't do that stuff. Still, it was very lively in that way. And then with the Holloway, we had, in addition, money to have some younger poet come and teach for a semester. And Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, came and taught for a year in the department. I remember taking my children to Easter Mass with my wife when we first arrived back in Berkeley at St. Mary Magdalene Church over on Berryman Street, and noticed in front of me Milosz and Seamus Heaney, who didn't know each other at that point, sitting on opposite places, two poets who were going to go on to win the Nobel Prize, were in the mid-70s, sitting listening to a bunch of school children sing Easter songs in the church. So anyway, Berkeley was a miraculous place in many ways, but also figuring out how to get that richness into the lives of the undergraduates. Graduate students found their own way to the poetry scenes. It wasn't a problem, but figuring out a culture that would make poetry rich, accessible, available, interesting part of their lives was in the feel of Wheeler Hall when they walked through it. That was the interesting task, and you're doing it now. I think it is that place.
Yes, but one of the things I inherited from you is an example of your making culture rather than just coming upon it. Lunch poems. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what caused you to institute that, and then maybe also talk about the Addison Street project as well, poetry outside the university.
Yeah, I don't know how much time we have, so because of course the other important, I mean, I will answer that question, but I want to finish the last one by saying the other critical piece of making this happen was hiring Lynn Hegenian. That outside the poetry culture of the department, which tended to be somewhat conservative in the 40s, 50s, 60s, was the Berkeley poetry culture. For people who might be listening to this who don't know, for poets like me, a teenager growing up and reading, there was something called the Berkeley Renaissance. There were a group of poets with Robert Duncan, who was an English major at Berkeley, and Jack Spicer, an English major at Berkeley, Robin Blazer, an English major at Berkeley, somewhat the same time Barbara Guest, the English major at Berkeley. There were really interesting poets in the new generation that got called the Berkeley Renaissance, who were publishing and reading in and around San Francisco at that time. And the graduate students could easily find their way to that poetry scene. And there was a faculty member, Tom Parkinson, who was a poet and a friend of many of the Beat poets, and in fact did a first academic anthology, a handbook of the Beat poets in the 60s, I guess. Tom would have done that anthology. And so there was enormously lively stuff going on in the Beats Out of City Lights and in and the scene in North Beach at San Francisco State, where there was a poetry center, and the graduate students could find their way to that. And out of that came in the 80s a group of poets who got very interested in how, it's hard to know how to describe. Do you have a handle on how to describe language poetry as a literary movement?
Well, I mean, it's right there in the name of the movement, right? They were interested in materiality of language. They distrusted straightforward communication. And they were also very interested in disrupting the kind of reason that Ivor Winters had been defending. In part, I think also because of a history of mistrusting communiques from the government about the war in Vietnam, et cetera, as well as a whole boatload of theory from the continent. But they were also no longer particularly interested in confessing the details of a particular person's interior experience, so much as seeing what language itself could disclose.
Yeah. So Lynn, I mean, for example, Lynn was in some way responsible for getting a whole new generation to read Gertrude Stein, to read poetry that's trying to see if language can do with abstraction what painting did with abstraction, or with, so, and she's brilliant at that work, and she joined the department in the 2000 and was just a force for bringing energy and to the place. And lunch poems was really just part of that. I didn't exactly start it. That is, a graduate student who was working for me when I had the odd job of being poet laureate, and a staff person, a poet named and playwright named Zach Rogo, came to me and said, we want to start a poetry series, daytime poetry series for the staff. And I think they were feeling that the night poet, the Holloway, the evening poetry series, which was very strong on experimental work, was was apt to reach people who were already very interested in poetry. They wanted people who were livelier performers. To talk about the poetry scene reminds me that you can't also talk about it without talking about June Jordan and Poetry for the People. That the year before I was hired in 1988, an African-American poet, June Jordan, came to the department and came to the African-American Studies program and started a hugely popular creative writing program, kind of taught on a large basis, get a lot of people writing stuff, encourage them particularly to write about political issues, encourage them to write about personal politics, identity politics, ethnicity politics. And so that was also happening on campus at that time. And they also were very strong on performance. I had the prejudice of someone who thinks that it's the written words on the page that matter the most. And anyway, Zach and Natalie Gerber said, can we start a noontime program? And I went to the library, or did Zach do it? Anyway, Dave Dewar, who was the head of development at the library, encouraged us and found a donor, and we were able to have a once a month poetry series. We began it each semester or each year. We would begin it with faculty and staff and waiters from the faculty club and basketball coaches reading their favorite poem, and end the year with a group of students reading their poems. And then in the middle, we had every year spaces for 6 or 7 poets to read in the Morrison Room of the library. The most recent one of which you missed, Geoffrey, it was really fun to see Louise Glick reading, because as happened when with a few other readings, the galleries were just jammed. People were standing outside on the cement benches looking in through the window to see. There were students sitting reverently on the floor, listening, surrounded by all the sort of elegant old busts of the Morrison Room.
I think that happened when I had you back to read as well, by the way.
Yeah,
It's happened a few times.
Yeah. Gary Snyder had a huge reading. When Adrian Rich read, we had to move it to iHouse because there were too many people for even the Morrison Room to hold.
There is something about
and that spilled over. So a landscape architect in town in Berkeley decided that something needed to be done with, and he approached the city council and said, we really need to turn Addison Street into an arts district. We have the Berkeley rep there, and we have freight and salvage, the folk jazz venue there, and a music school. So he proposed to them putting squares of poetry in the street, and approached me about it. And I said I would do it if I could do what I wanted and didn't have to go to committee meetings. And so we made an anthology of the history of Berkeley poetry in the street on Addison Street, which was fun.
Not your only anthology, but the only one made of metal and on which you can.
Yes. So you had to really be careful about typos, because it was they're actually there. It's stainless, not stainless steel with enamel lettering, the kind of enamel you make teeth with. So it was dusty black and very white, and then rusted toward a tan and almond shades of color. I was able, going back to Berkeley, had one of the first creative writing courses ever taught at an American university back in the 1910s, taught by a poet named Witter Binner. Witter Binner had been a classmate of Wallace Stevens at Harvard. They edited the Advocate together. And Binner came out and to teach. Who invited him or how is lost. I tried to find out. But Binner came out and proposed to the English department that he teach a creative writing class. I don't know if they used the word creative writing then. Had the student taught a class in which the students called the writing of poetry. Several of the poets, the young graduates, undergraduates who signed up for that class, went on to become writers. One of them a writer for the New Yorker magazine in its early years, another of them a published poet. Anyway, Witter Binner, I got able to get his poems, get the poems of some of his students, poems of the poets in the 30s, so on. It was fun, all into the street in Berkeley.
How many are there? I don't remember how many plates there are.
There are about 50, I think.
Well, let me make the inelegant segue, given that we're talking about infrastructure and the streets of Berkeley, to another aspect of being on campus from '89 to 2019. The fight for public education, the funding and defunding vicissitudes of that time, as well as activism, both on campus and of course for you as well, off as well. Could you talk about what you saw across that 30-year arc a little bit?
During my time, during the 30 years I was at Berkeley, aside from regularly recurring student strikes, often over wages to part-time workers and to graduate students, the big event was the demonstrations around Occupy, which led to students camping on campus in tents, and the administration felt the need to move them off campus and called in the local police to do that. And Geoffrey, do you want to tell your part of this story?
Well, I mean, we both went to defend the tents, and we were both knocked down by police, who I don't even think were local. I don't think they were only from Oakland or Berkeley. They have their own version of mutual aid, and I think they came from farther afield as well, which means they don't have any investment in the community. And the tons were swinging. It was not a pretty sight.
Yeah, in retrospect, it seems odd that there was, I think it started on the East Coast, but it around the idea that about 10% of the population commanded about 90% of the wealth, and that was wrong, and started holding rallies and occupying various public spaces. So it got the name of the Occupy movement, and it sprang up all over the place. It sprang up in Oakland and in Berkeley, and the students at Berkeley meant that they were going to sit in. It was never absolutely clear what the demands were of the Occupy movement on the so they were marching, but they would march saying, "Whose university? Our university. Whose university? Our university." And I sort of wanted to say, the university belongs to the whole, to all the people of California, but through the generations of donations of alumni and others interested in public education going back to the 1860s. And how we claim it now, complicated matter, but wanted to defend the right of the students to do this protest. And I heard one day that in the afternoon, the police had come and using batons had beat the students off the campus. I didn't quite believe that they would do anything quite so brutal and stupid. So my wife and I turned around from somewhere we were going, having heard this on the radio, and drove back to the campus, where outside Sproul Hall, there were lots of students, hundreds, I think, fair to say, Geoffrey.
Yeah.
And you were there.
Yeah, on the steps where the FSM had proclaimed what it wanted to proclaim.
Yeah, so we went to I wanted to get to the front of the line. I wanted to get to the place where the students were meeting with it turns out with people, mostly young people from the Alameda County Sheriff's Department, were lined up in Darth Vader outfits and starting to form a wedge to drive the students away. And then at some point, and so when we got to the front of the crowd, where we could see what was happening, the police and the sheriff's deputies had gotten a signal to move the crowd. And so one of the young deputies reached out and shoved my wife hard and knocked her down. And as they were moving, we couldn't move forward or backward from where we were. And then they just started whacking at us with what the newspapers called batons, and they were billy clubs with about the size of a little league baseball bat, whacking you back. And it worked. It cleared the place. The next day, the students came back having been told they absolutely couldn't camp there, and they had tied balloons to tents. So they're floating above the place where they had been driven out. In the air were these big REI, orange and blue, Sierra hiking tents. And I think it was you, Geoffrey, who said they had figured out if they couldn't occupy the ground, they would occupy the air. So, anyway,
clever.
A memorable event. And I wrote a description of it the next day for the op-ed page of the New York Times, which got reprinted often. And one of the graduate students had said, who studied the Beat Generation movement, had made a little sign the next day that said, "Beat poets, not beat poets."
It had to be said. And that moment, I think, rippled across buildings on campus and for years to come in terms of thinking about the relationship between the administration and the police and student protest in important ways. So let's move towards the end and think about why you wrapped up in 2019 and what you've been doing since then, how you conceive of work and education post your formal employ.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing to talk about a little bit, at least, is that as a result, during the time, so in 1995, when I was invited to be Poet Laureate, I assumed that it was because they had never invited anyone from the west of the Mississippi. I don't know if they'd ever invited anyone from west of the Alleghenies, and that I should somehow represent Western writing during my time in Washington. And so I talked to friends and we organized this environmental conference on it to be held at the Library of Congress in DC. To be held in the springtime, when there were many contested environmental pieces of environmental legislation up for grabs, which made the Library of Congress very nervous. But as a result of thinking about that, I found, it was 1995, my a friend in the environmental science policy and management program by a plant pathologist named Greg Gilbert approached me and said, or I don't know, he approached me, we were talking, and he was teaching an introduction to environmental science and policy course, and said, why don't we do an introduction to environmental studies course together and team teach it? And so I had to go to the English department and say, can we do this lower division undergraduate course? And Berkeley, being Berkeley, they said, sure, of course, go for it. And so we did. Started it in 1996. I taught it with Greg for 2 years. And like the teaching of the American poetry course, it was, how do I teach this? What do I bring? We had 200 students sign up for the first iteration. I think in the end, we only had 150 in the class, but still, how you teach a class that big and make people feel like they're participating individually, being seen individually. And then Gary Esposito, who was the professor of geochemistry, said he would, when Greg left, said he would love to join me to do it. And so for 20 years, Gary and I taught this every fall taught this undergraduate introduction to environmental studies course, which was another huge gift that the university gave us. I was feeling at the time like so urgent about environmental issues that I felt like I just wanted to be doing something about educating people toward environmental citizenship. And we talked about that and what that would involve and what might do it. And one of the things it involved was, for me, was watching Gary Sposito, who had edited in Oxford the Cambridge University anthology on geochemistry, textbook on geochemistry, and served on the South California State Assembly's committee that vetted environmental bills. Gary worked in hydrology, soil science, environmental issues across the boards, received a big grant to figure out the geology of if the smokestacks of coal-burning plants could be scrubbed and get the CO2 out of them, where could you put it in the earth where it would not just come up and it's all the same. Anyway, he worked on many interesting problems, and he was a brilliant, careful, lovingly methodical, and imaginative teacher. And watching him teach and teaching with him was a huge gift for me. And it meant that as we tried to think, well, in the first years we were doing it, it was a matter of looking at the still controversial science of climate change, whether it was anthropogenic, caused by human activity or not. There is still a massive amount of misinformation and disinformation on the subject. So having the students read carefully the ice core studies of the history of temperature on the planet and so on was part of our work then from the beginning. Though it began, of course, with saying what do people need to know in order to be environmental citizens. They need to know how science is done. They need to know the language of the discourse on this subject. When somebody says that the Alaskan National Reserve is pristine, what does pristine mean? Is that a value term that you can put measures to of any kind, so on? Anyway, stuff like that. As we said, to find the areas that need to be addressed, Gary knew who in environmental science policy and management could be guest speakers. And there I got another sense of what can be rich and amazing about Berkeley. That is, in talking about agricultural regimens. And there was Miguel Altieri, who created a Center for Agroecology, come to talk to our students every year. Miguel's premise was that most of the development work to try to improve the quality and productivity of agriculture in the third world, in Latin America and in Africa, and in some parts of Asia specifically, meant issuing money, loans to farmers so that they could buy expensive equipment and imitate agribusiness ways of production, and that basically pauperized them, put them in debt, and made them dependent on really destructive nitrogen fertilizers, which they had to pay back the cost of. So he was trying to figure out how to use the agricultural methods, especially in Latin America, of production and intensify them without pauperizing people and basically putting the development money in the pockets of manufacturers. Really smart, interesting lectures. Justin Broschers, who's a wildlife ecologist, could show the students a photograph of the Norwegian Parliament voting for their annual subsidy to their fishing fleets. and then a slide of the fishing fleets off the West African coast, sucking up fish in these huge vacuum cleaner ships that the Parliament had paid for, and then showing the empty classrooms in the schools along the coast because the kids had to be in the boat with their parents because the parents had to go further and further out to sea to get the fishing fields that the Norwegian or American or English or German fishing boats had not already sucked up. Ines Fung, who was doing the work on climate change, was part of the group that got the Nobel Prize for their work on climate change, spoke to the class. Ignacio Chappelli, who was working on the way that genetically modified crops were leaking into areas where they were replacing the rich ecosystems of the that are native to the place, and in the process affecting pollinators, changing the patterns of butterfly. But anyway, it was somebody else when there was an issue of how tropical forests could regenerate compared to forests in cool climates. Strong in the literature was the idea that they don't regenerate much at all because the soil is so poor. And Nancy Peluso was right there to come in. She wore a hard hat to come into class and talk about what it was really like working in Indonesian forests that had been clear cut and how to regenerate them. So I had in that class the really interesting challenge again of how to organize material, but then also of seeing the incredible work that's been going on at the university in so many different ways. So that was a huge gift, has been. And then Michael Pollan, we invited when we come talk about agriculture and food policy. Then we talk about his book of The Botany of Desire, on how the planet had been changed by human appetites, and the way that the premise of that book, as he said, was that humans had been recruited by grasses to defeat forests because humans like to do grain. And and then Michael's work with Gary Sposito led Alice Waters to make a contribution to make sure that there was a food course, the ecology of food course in the environmental science program. And one of the things I found with the teaching was that the students responded to that very intensely because they're very concerned about the climate. They want to train themselves with skills in their lives that can address the problems of the future. And the one area that they can have some control over now for the first time in their lives, because they're away from their parents' homes, is how they shop and how they eat. So watching them wake up and get excited as we brought in speakers to talk, like Michael, to talk about agriculture and the marketing of food and diet and in America. That was really fun and interesting to see.
I can't help but observe that you started at Buffalo already thinking about teaching as collaborative and curational, bringing all those poets in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and you ended up mixing it up with all these scientists and doing the same thing in a different field of knowledge, but the same idea that knowledge production is really only done by a group and across differences and specialties rather than only within one. It's lovely to see that bookending your career so emphatically. So what happens when you retire and don't have the same forms of access to that space of exchange? What have you been doing?
Yeah, I found my way without thinking one way or the other about it. I found my way gravitating back to it in various ways through Zoom conversations. Um, an intense area of my experience of Berkeley was my 20 years of collaborating with Czesław Miłosz on the translation of his poems. It's a topic for another time, but for, from the 1930s in Lithuania through the 1940s in Nazi-occupied Warsaw, through the 40s and 50s and 60s and the cold struggles over literature in the Cold War. Miłosz was writing, accumulating this body of work, came to Berkeley in 1960. His work was banned in Poland, so he's writing poems about the sun going down over San Francisco Bay in Polish that nobody can read, where the sun is going down and nobody can read and who would understand the language. And so for 20 years, we would meet on Monday mornings and he would have a rough English translation of his poems and we would work on those. So Czesław died in 2004. And I went as a representative of the university with David Frick, who was then chair of the Slavic Languages Department, to represent the university at the funeral in Krakow, in the beautiful central square in Krakow. And I'm still working at Czesław's poems. I find that the poems that he wrote when he was a diplomat in Washington in the 1940s, as the Cold War was making politics impossible, or making for impossible politics. So I've been working at that. And I taught an online class through the summer program of the Community of Writers up in the Sierra Nevada on Czesław's poems. And I'm in a couple of reading groups that get together and read poems and talk about them. So it turns out that, I don't know what your experience is, but it turns out that there's an entirely lively world of conversation out there that seems to have satisfied my appetite for what I feared I would miss not being in the classroom.
Surprised that you've refused to equate retirement with solitariness, and I'm really glad that you've been able to do that. I think we can wrap up there. I want to thank you for giving us such a rich repository. It feels like legacy has many, many meanings and senses in relation to this conversation. So thank you very much for all of that portage from a life well lived and well taught.
Well, thank you, Geoffrey, and thank the folks who devised this for the UC retirement community.